seizing the center immediately. This opening thrust opens diagonals for your queen and bishop, dictating early development. Sicilians immediately create imbalanced pawn structures, forcing dynamic play from the outset. Developing a knight so early here aims to build a central pawn presence and prepare for swift queenside castling, instantly bolstering the center's influence. This knight maneuver prepares for rapid development and sets up intriguing pawn structure possibilities. Unleashing central pressure. White immediately contests the pawn structure and seeks to open lines for a swift attack. Black surrenders the center, opening lines but ceding valuable central space for piece development. A knight lands squarely in the center, immediately challenging Black's pawn structure and preparing rapid development. Instantly challenging the central pawn and developing a piece. This knight prepares to castle and unifies Black's pieces for a dynamic fight. Securing the pawn center further. This knight establishes a formidable central presence and prepares for future pawn thrusts. Instantly confronting the knight disrupts White's central control and creates immediate pawn tension. Unleashing a knight to b5 immediately stakes a claim on the d6 square, pressuring Black's queenside and potentially disrupting pawn structures. White is aiming for rapid development and immediate tactical complications, forcing Black to react defensively and potentially creating weaknesses around their king. This aggressive stance requires precise calculation from Black to avoid falling into a material disadvantage or positional bind. Opening up the bishop on c8 and preparing to challenge the knight that's so aggressively positioned. On b5, d6 solidifies Black's central pawn structure while creating valuable escape squares for the king. It's a crucial step in developing counterplay. Developing the bishop to g5 immediately pins the knight on f6, creating a crucial structural weakness for Black's center. This pressure forces a decision about how Black will deal with the doubled pawns that would arise if the knight were to move without addressing the pin, a consideration that will shape the middle game. Challenging the knight's outpost forces an immediate decision, seeking to disrupt White's central control and gain a tempo for piece development, though it slightly weakens the queenside pawn structure. Retreating the knight to allow it to reposition via c2 or b5 to potentially attack the d6 pawn or control the center again offers a passive, somewhat defensive posture. Pushing the b-pawn aggressively seeks to disrupt White's queenside pawn structure and create immediate counterplay, a common theme in the Sicilian, but it also opens lines towards Black's king and might overextend the queenside before development is complete. Sacrificing material for a clear positional advantage. White immediately opens the g-file towards Black's king, creating dynamic play. This exchange, while giving up the bishop pair, aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure and launch a kingside assault. The vacated squares can now be exploited for rapid piece development, putting immediate pressure on Black's king's safety. Sacrificing pawn structure for an open kingside is a bold decision, potentially creating attacking chances but leaving your monarch somewhat exposed. Opening a decisive central file for the rook and activating the knight onto a forward outpost. This maneuver decisively addresses the structural damage incurred by Black's pawn capture, creating immediate attacking prospects against the king's defenses and exerting pressure along the d-file, challenging the knight's dominion over the center. This move aggressively seeks to dismantle White's central pawn structure and unlock the f-file for counterplay, though it does introduce potential weaknesses around the king. A cautious stabilization aiming to secure the d5 knight and prepare for potential queenside expansion. Strategic choice. Instead of immediately contesting the center or launching an attack, White prioritizes fortifying their knight on d5 and laying the groundwork for advancing the c-pawn. This suggests a longer-term positional plan, possibly involving controlling key squares or building a solid pawn structure. Pawn structure impact. The c3 pawn solidifies White's central control and offers support to the d4 pawn, preventing Black from easily challenging it. However, it does create a slight weakness on the d3 square and restricts the movement of White's queens. Bishop should it wish to reposition. Future possibilities. This move opens up lines for the queen's rook to potentially enter the game via the c-file, and it can be seen as a preparatory step for pushing the b4 pawn, aiming to gain space on the queenside. It also offers a safe haven for the d5 knight should it face immediate threats. Underlying tension. Asterisk. While seemingly quiet, this move sets the stage for a battle of attrition. White is building a robust position, and Black will need to find active counterplay to avoid being slowly squeezed. The pawn chains that are developing will dictate much of the future positional struggle. Reclaiming central control and activating the bishop's diagonal offers Black excellent counterplay, targeting the compromised queenside pawn structure and preparing to launch an assault on White's king, which is now exposed due to the removed kingside defenders. Opening up the e-file for your rook and potentially creating a pawn lever on the kingside. This exchange immediately injects dynamic possibilities into the game. By surrendering the bishop pair, you're banking on this newfound activity to compensate for the structural weaknesses Black has introduced. Consider how this opens lines for your pieces to penetrate the enemy position. Unlocking the central diagonal for the bishop. This development aggressively challenges White's knight and eyes the weakened f2 square. A bold territorial claim that promises active counterplay. The knight tucks back, a strategic repositioning aimed at potentially reinforcing the kingside or preparing for a central push, while also freeing up the d2 square for the queen to join the fray. Fortifying the monarch's safety is paramount after the bishop's capture, creating a crucial defensive shield while simultaneously preparing for potential counterplay on the queenside. A fascinating repositioning, shifting the knight from the seemingly exposed outpost to a more flexible central square, potentially eyeing the kingside weaknesses that have emerged following Black's pawn advances. Harnessing the bishop's newfound diagonal reach. Black repositions it to a square where it actively guards the king's sanctuary and pressures White's central pawn structure, setting the stage for potential pawn breaks or piece development on the kingside. Unleashing a pawn storm with g4 signals a bold intention to seize the initiative on the kingside, aiming to dismantle Black's pawn structure and create attacking avenues, though it simultaneously weakens White's own king safety and opens up potential counterplay for Black along the newly created open g-file. Challenging White's central pawn structure. Black immediately aims to destabilize the knight's strong outpost and create dynamic counterplay on the queenside, seeking to open lines for his bishop and potentially attack the White king's shelter. Opening up the g-file with the bishop provides attacking potential, but also exposes your king to potential counterplay down that very path. A trade-off to consider as Black develops their pieces and eyes those open lines. Opening up that b-file creates an immediate, sharp challenge for White's queenside structure, forcing a decision about how to defend the weakened pawns. Suddenly, the pawn structure is shattered, creating a very sharp, unbalanced position where White seeks to exploit the open files with his rooks, while Black's king looks rather exposed after the recent pawn advances. Black's rook finds a more active posting on the open c-file, challenging White's control and creating immediate tension. This piece's redeployment is a vital step towards coordinating an assault on white's somewhat exposed king. Unleashing the queen to challenge the open c-file. White aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially pry open lines towards the king. Seizing the initiative, black bravely pushes forward, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and open lines for counterplay. This aggressive advance creates immediate tactical complications and forces white to re-evaluate their attacking plans. The pawn on e4 now acts as a potent outpost, restricting white's minor pieces and potentially serving as a springboard for further aggression towards white's king. The cramped nature of white's pieces, particularly the knight on a3, becomes even more apparent as the board opens up. This bold pawn thrust is a clear declaration of intent, signaling black's readiness to engage in a sharp, tactical battle. Reclaiming a piece after the aggressive pawn push creates a sudden shift in the tactical landscape, forcing an immediate recalculation of material and positional advantages. A daring pawn sacrifice to shatter white's central pawn mass and open lines towards the king. Focusing on the kingside pawn storm's potential disruption. This redeployment of the queen to defend the bishop on e4 seems intended to solidify white's central control while simultaneously preparing for further pawn advances, potentially targeting black's newly formed weaknesses around the f-pawn. Observe how the e-pawn, now indirectly supported, might become a key piece in future exchanges, dictating the flow of the game by challenging black's advanced pieces. The pressure now shifts to black to address this central duo before white can exploit the open lines. Unleashing the knight to g4 boldly assaults the king's pawn structure, aiming to destabilize white's royal camp and potentially open lines for a quick attack, though it leaves the knight somewhat exposed and reliant on subsequent piece support. A bold assertion of kingside pressure. This move, 21. Rg1, lunges the rook to a more active square, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure after ***20, nxg4. It's a decision that prioritizes immediate attacking potential over defensive solidity, setting the stage for a sharp, tactical battle where precise calculation will be paramount. Boldly accepting the sacrifice, black initiates a dramatic positional reshuffle, aiming to shatter white's kingside defenses and exploit the awkward placement of the knight on g1. This aggressive thrust into the enemy camp, while seemingly ignoring material, seeks to create immediate tactical complications and disrupt white's coordinated pieces, potentially leading to a swift attack or forcing white into a passive defensive posture. Reclaiming the sacrificed queen, white steers the game back towards equilibrium, aiming to neutralize black's aggressive pawn thrust and regain material balance before deeper complications set in, though the g-file remains a tantalizing, yet potentially risky, avenue for exploitation. The king instinctively seeks sanctuary on the back rank, a typical defensive maneuver to escape immediate threats, even if it means sacrificing some piece activity. Shifting the monarch away from the recently opened files, King William seeks a sanctuary behind his own pawns, acknowledging the perilous path his attack has led him into, potentially preparing for a defensive maneuver or a future pawn thrust. The queen's venture to h4 immediately throws a dart at white's uncastled king, initiating a direct, aggressive threat that demands immediate attention and disrupts white's planned pawn advances. Gaining control of the open d-file, white immediately challenges black's rook and prepares to join forces with the queen for an assault. A bold attempt to activate the rook, pushing it towards the king's potential escape squares and aiming to disrupt white's central control, though it might leave the bishop on g7 slightly less defended. unveiling an attacking opportunity. This move shifts the focus to the beleaguered black king, forcing a critical defensive decision. A bold declaration of intent. This check rips open the king's defenses and demands immediate attention, highlighting the precariousness of white's position after the recent pawn sacrifice. Reclaiming the diagonal gives white's king a bit more breathing room, though the doubled pawns on the g-file remain a structural weakness. A sharp dive into the opponent's king defenses, aiming to break through the pawn shield and exploit the exposed monarch. Unleashing the queen from behind your own pawns. White aims to disrupt black's dangerous kingside pressure and potentially exploit the discovered attack on the e3 knight. This bold maneuver seeks to seize the initiative, forcing black to account for threats they might not have anticipated. The exchange of queens simplifies the position significantly, a decision that strongly favors black given the exposed nature of white's king and the weakened pawn structure around it. This transition into an endgame, while perhaps seeming passive, sets the stage for black to exploit the open lines and the kingside weaknesses that white has inadvertently created. Notice how the bishop pair, no longer needing to coordinate in a complex middle game, can now dominate the board. The challenge for white will be to consolidate and defend against black's active pieces and potential pawn advances, a task made considerably harder with the queens off the board. Initiating the endgame now with the rook's activation, white aims to leverage the open d-file for potential future pressure, hoping to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's king. The bishop retreats, seeking a more active diagonal now that the queens have been exchanged, aiming to pressure white's uncastled king and potentially support a pawn advance later. Reshaping the pawn structure, white seeks to neutralize black's queenside initiative by eliminating the troublesome passed pawn, and aiming for a simpler, more manageable position where piece activity can be better coordinated. The exchange of the rooks on the third rank immediately simplifies the position, transforming the dynamic struggle into a clear evaluation of material and pawn structure. Black has just given up an exchange for 2 pawns, a significant sacrifice that needs immediate justification. The open d-file, now only contested by the lone white rook, presents a potential avenue for white to exploit, and black's king, while currently shielded, might find itself exposed if white can organize an attack along it. The question is whether black's doubled pawns on the f-file and improved piece activity will compensate for the material deficit in the ensuing endgame. The pawn storm on the kingside has finally subsided, leaving white with a rather fragmented structure, but this capture clears the central files for potential piece activity. Black aims to activate the rook on the open b-file, threatening to create immediate pressure and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure if white isn't careful. Reclaiming central space after the exchange is crucial, and this pawn push directly challenges black's bishop battery on the kingside, forcing a decision. The pawn push opens up crucial central space and allows the bishop to redeploy to a more active diagonal, aiming to potentially pressure the weakened kingside pawn structure. Refocusing the bishop's gaze to the kingside potentially prepares a more active role for it, perhaps supporting a future pawn push or contributing to a potential kingside attack. Aiming to leverage the space advantage white has consolidated on that flank while anticipating black's maneuvering, unleashing a determined rook to the first rank. This aggressive push seeks to disrupt white's recently organized pieces and capitalize on the open file, potentially creating mating threats or forcing material concessions. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount, especially with such active enemy rooks threatening open lines. Securing the opponent's king with a check, This maneuver aims to exploit the unprotected nature of White's monarch and potentially disrupt its defensive setup before a full endgame transition. Refocusing the bishop's gaze from the vacated d-file. This maneuver aims to protect the beleaguered pawns on the queenside while preparing a slow but steady advance of the remaining central pawns. It sidesteps the immediate tactical skirmishes and prioritizes structural integrity, anticipating a potential endgame where each pawn will count. The rook's capture of the pawn opens a critical file, immediately intensifying the pressure along the 7th rank and posing a serious threat to White's king's safety, which is currently exposed. A valiant attempt to erect defenses. This rook-pawn push aims to create a crucial space for the king, though it exposes the pawn chain to a potential pawn lever on the queenside. Pushing the pawn forward creates an immediate threat to the bishop and aims to gain valuable queenside space, potentially opening a pathway for the rook or creating outpost possibilities for future piece maneuvering. Pawns now advance on the kingside, creating space for the rook to potentially join the attack, but also weakening the king's shelter. This defensive maneuver, h6, aims to create breathing room for the black king, preventing White's rook and bishop from converging on the kingside through the g-file or potentially exploiting weaknesses around the 7th rank. It's a prophylactic measure, a subtle attempt to shore up the defenses before White's initiative fully materializes. While it may appear passive, this move subtly dictates White's immediate plans, forcing them to reconsider their attacking angles and potentially offering black a chance to regroup and find counterplay on the queenside or through central pawn breaks if White isn't careful. The tension around the kingside has now been addressed, but the pawn structure on this side of the board remains somewhat compromised. Bringing the king to the center signals a bold attempt to join the fight, aiming to activate this formerly passive piece and potentially create new attacking avenues or bolster defensive structures as the queens depart the board. Suddenly surrendering the bishop pair, Black aims to simplify into an endgame where their more active king might offer winning chances against White's isolated pawn on the queenside. Opening the e-file offers White a crucial avenue to challenge Black's pawns and potentially activate the rook, creating dynamic counterplay in a position where Black's central control seems solid. Sacrificing the bishop on c3 opens a precarious path, trading material for initiative, and attempting to disrupt White's pawn structure before the king can find safety. Gaining a foothold on the queenside, this bishop maneuver immediately challenges Black's passed pawn and aims to disrupt its advance, while also securing the square for potential future king safety maneuvers. Unlocking the a-file for the rook promises to destabilize White's pawn structure and create immediate pressure along that critical path. Unlocking the a-file is key here. The bishop's repositioning aims to prepare for a potential advance of the queen's knight pawn, creating further queenside space and threatening to trap the rook. Reclaiming the open file offers a crucial lifeline, aiming to disrupt White's monolithic pawn structure and potentially activate the rook for counterplay. Cornering the rook with the bishop creates immediate threats and severely restricts Black's options, forcing a difficult decision about how to salvage the piece or concede material. Unleashing a desperate check, Black hopes to disrupt White's meticulously built structure and perhaps create some chaos around the enemy king. This forced sequence might offer a glimmer of hope in an otherwise dire situation. Aiming to exploit any slight disarray or positional weakness White might have overlooked in their pursuit of the current advantage. The king, finally escaping its defensive confinement, now strides boldly towards the center, a potent attacking piece in this unusual endgame where material equality belies the fractured pawn. Structure. The rook's repositioning to e5 aims to challenge white's control of the e-file and potentially infiltrate the second rank, disrupting white's centralized pieces and creating opportunities for counterplay against the weakened kingside pawn structure. Asserting control over the open file is paramount, aiming to restrict black's rook mobility and prepare a decisive pawn advance. Embracing a more defensive posture. The king ventures out, seeking to anchor itself behind the advancing pawns and offer support to its queen. That check forces the opposing king to a more secure spot, consolidating black's defensive setup while white's pieces remain somewhat disjointed, potentially setting up a more dangerous counterattack once the defenses are solidified. The king's journey is far from over, and seeking refuge on the kingside offers a more secure harbor than lingering on the open e-file, particularly with the rook now centralized and poised to exploit any weakness. Keeping the rook on the open file is key, eyeing that potential weakness on the h-pawn and ready to swing over if needed to support the other rook. This square offers the black king a breath of fresh air, escaping the immediate pressure along the central files and potentially setting up for a more active role in the upcoming endgame. Reactivating the monarch's offensive potential is the primary goal here, aiming to leverage the king's newfound mobility to support the pawn chain and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. Seeking to disrupt white's newly established pawn chain and potentially activate the rook, black repositions the bishop to a more ambitious square, eyeing potential weaknesses on the queenside. A shift in focus from the central struggle to maneuvering the rook into a more active defensive position, aiming to solidify the pawn structure against black's encroaching bishop. Shifting the king towards the center is a bold attempt to gain activity in a position where pawns are locked down, but it also exposes the king to potential discoveries down the g-file if white can ever open it. Further, activating the king's defensive potential offers a vital sanctuary, shielding it from potential threats while repositioning it to influence the center and support the queenside pawn's advance. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's king safety and perhaps create some unexpected complications. Asterisk. Coach's analysis. This move injects a bit of life into a position that was becoming quite stagnant. Black's king is looking a little exposed, and the rook on f5 aims to exploit any inaccuracies by white. It's a hopeful gambit for activity in a quiet endgame. The key for white will be to navigate this check calmly, perhaps by interposing a piece or moving the king to a safer square, without allowing black any lasting initiative. The pawn structure is quite solid for white, so the immediate threat isn't catastrophic, but it certainly requires attention and precise calculation to avoid falling into a tactical trap or positional disadvantage. Asterisk. Seeking to outflank the encroaching rook on the queenside. This king repositioning aims to reinforce the pawns and potentially initiate a counterplay or offer support for a rook lift. The king's exposed position is now the primary target, and this forcing check aims to disrupt white's defense and potentially open lines to the monarch. That king shuffle offers no real respite. The rook on g1 is now perfectly positioned to support the invasion along the open g-file, aiming to exploit any weakness around the black monarch. The bishop now retreats to c3, a curious repositioning considering its prior activity on the queenside. It seems to be aiming for a defensive posture, perhaps to reinforce the king's side or anticipate a queenside pawn push, though the immediate threat is not apparent and it abandons its influence on the open files. This retreat strategically pulls the king back from the immediate firing line, aiming to consolidate its position behind the newly advanced pawns and prepare for potential pawn pushes or to offer a safer haven from black's active rook and bishop. The rook's aggressive foray across the board, aiming to disrupt white's newly consolidated pieces, creates immediate tactical possibilities by forcing the opposing king into a precarious position near the center and opening lines for black's remaining pieces. The king cautiously advances, seeking refuge behind its remaining pawns. The rook's journey to b4 dramatically alters the endgame landscape, shifting focus to the pawns on the queenside and setting up a potential defense or counterplay against white's advancing king. Focusing on the open file, white seeks to challenge the rook on b4. The bishop's retreat here aims to regroup and defend the weakened kingside pawns. But it also cedes control of the crucial central light squares and opens up the a-file for white's rook to potentially infiltrate later. The bishop now retreats, abandoning the fight for the d4 square but preparing to defend the kingside and potentially influence the central pawn structure. Black aims to secure the rook on the 7th rank, creating a potential outpost or a pathway to attack white's exposed king. The bishop tucks itself away, a seemingly passive retreat, but it prepares to guard the important light squares now that black's pawn structure is more consolidated. The black king, seeking a more active role, steps onto the 5th rank, aiming to bolster the pawn structure and potentially create new attacking avenues on the queenside. Bringing the rook into the fray with check aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially force a favorable exchange, creating new avenues for attack. The pawn structure is fundamentally broken, and the king, despite the recent activity, is now exposed to a dangerous assault along the open file. Repositioning the king to a more active square is paramount to exploit the open files and potential pawn breakthroughs that now dominate the board. Unleashing a final challenge, black's bishop momentarily disrupts white's king's fragile sanctuary, a desperate attempt to rekindle some fight in what has become a one-sided exchange. Repositioning the king to the edge of the board seems to invite further checks and complications, potentially exposing it to the rook and bishop on the 7th rank. Pushing the king to the edge now opens up possibilities for white's rook to get behind the pawn structure, potentially creating a mating net. Reclaiming the a-file offers a crucial pivot, aiming to penetrate black's defenses and potentially disrupt their pawn structure, a vital step in an endgame where every pawn counts. Unleashing the rook from its protective pawn shield, black aims to disrupt white's bishop's reign and reclaim initiative by attacking the uncastled king. On the queenside, pushing the rook to the f-file offers a potent way to challenge the black king's safety by opening lines of attack against its pawn shield and potentially creating mating threats down the open file. This retreat signals a recognition that the rook is not ideally placed to defend the vulnerable 7th rank, and a more active role for the king in the endgame is now prioritized. The rook's presence on the f-file now presents a powerful attacking prospect, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside structure and potential discovered threats against the black king, should it ever venture too far from its protective pawns. The rook's deployment to the 2nd rank sets up a promising battery, aiming to exploit the open c-file and create threats against white's relatively exposed king.